Welcome to SCDM's AI and eSource podcast series. My name is Aruna Vatikola, and I serve as SCDM eSource Implementation Consortium co lead. Mission of the consortia is to promote the adoption of eSource within clinical research. The FDA defines eSource or electronic source data as data that are initially recorded in electronic format. Examples include direct from device data capture, such as wearables or sensors, direct from patient or clinician, such as electronic clinical outcome assessment, ECOA, or direct from EHR or electronic data capture, EDC system. The use of artificial intelligence in its many forms, whether generative AI, agentic AI, machine learning, natural language processing, large language models, or GPT, has the potential to increase eSource adoption through the most effective implementation processes, documentation, training, validation, etc. This podcast series will talk with folks using AI, in particular with eSource, from multiple clinical research perspectives, sites, sponsors, and technology vendors. Today's guest is William Illis, Executive Director of Technology and Scientific Computing for Drug Development at Novartis, who will be sharing his insights from the sponsor's point of view. Bill is all innovating the way clinical trial works for the benefit of patients worldwide. For the past several years, he has led the Digital Data Flow Initiative at the Pharmaceutical Industry Consortium Transcelerate, recognizing the foundational nature of clinical trials. This work is centered removing analog inefficiencies by building transformative industry-wide interoperability through the development and adoption of digital protocol standards in collaboration with CDISC. Focused on sustainable innovation, Bill has over 25 years of industry experience leading the design and implementation of impactful transformations in teams, line functions, and enterprise programs in the areas across healthcare R&D. At Novartis, he has led re-engineering programs and functional units in clinical operations, data management, data standards and governance, statistical programming, analytics, and R&D IT. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you, Aruna.
Thank you for meeting us today. I want to go over a quick disclaimer from SCDM before we get started. This podcast is provided by the Society for Clinical Data Management, SCDM, eSource Implementation Consortium. It is intended for information purposes only and does not constitute legal, regulatory, or professional advice. SCDM and the speakers are not responsible for any actions taken based on the information provided. Users are advised to consult with appropriate professionals for specific advice tailored to their individual circumstances. The opinions expressed are attributed to the speakers only and not their respective or former employers. So, let's get started. Bill, before we dive into AI, could you start by sharing what area of eSource in particular you focus on most? Examples being ECOA, EHR to EDC integrations, DHT, digital health technologies, wearables and sensors, digital protocols, monitoring, eSource training analysis, etc.
Happy to, Aruna. I'm glad to be here today with you and talk about AI and eSource and the way forward in the industry. To dig into your question, you mentioned the topic that's near and dear to my heart, which is digital protocols, and that's my starting point for getting into discussions about AI and eSource. So you might call it pre-eSource, but I'm really interested in using digital protocols to configure the way eSource works in the study execution by leveraging the digital protocol to automate that configuration according to protocol data requirements. And it applies to configuring all the types of eSource data collections that you mentioned, Aruna: direct data capture, site-based eSource solutions, EHR to EDC integrations, digital health devices, etc. So the opportunity is from one set of digital protocol requirements to have a consistent and automated and streamlined configuration of the eSource applications.
Wow, great. Digital protocols it is. Can you share what kind of eSource projects involving in digital protocols that you mentioned in the previously that involves AI you're currently working or you have worked on recently? And if you can, if you can specify what kind of AI technology is being used, for example, if you can elaborate, is it AI, generative AI, or agentic AI?
So I think about the application of AI into eSource. I think about this holistically across the study design, startup, and execution processes. And before we get specifically to eSource, as I mentioned, it's important to start at the very beginning. And by that, I mean the protocol authoring and study design.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't want to get too far down the path of improving eSource and data collection before using AI to improve your study design. And by that, I mean considering benchmarks like using site and patient burden scores to optimize your schedule of activities, looking at core versus non core procedures that are related to study objectives and endpoints, and evaluating things like inclusion and exclusion criteria to optimize your recruitment and your patient participation in your study. All of these improvements can result in better studies that meet their recruitment targets, collect less extraneous data, and have fewer protocol deviations and fewer costly protocol amendments. Then, from an improved study design, start using AI to auto configure your eSource systems. And then, following that, applying AI to your eSource data collection processes, including capabilities for things like extracting structured data from EHR notes, coding of verbatim terms against standard medical dictionaries, and identifying discrepancies and managing query resolutions. It's early days on many of these capabilities, but these are all areas that I would say are
Mm-hmm.
experimental we're exploring the capabilities of AI and how can it improve these end-to-end processes, starting all the way with study design through to the data collection and the associated eSource processes. Part two, I think, of your question, Aruna, relative to generative and agentic AI, in my view, it's not so much of an either or, but more of a continuum. So the technologies are not mutually exclusive.
Mm-hmm.
Agentic AI systems often use generative AI, specifically large language models, to quote unquote think, or more accurately, I would say, to make their guesses and produce content as part of a broader multi-step action plan. So a simple example using generative AI is often with coding assistance. So proposing Medra or WHO drug codes as we would normally see during a coding process and resolving ambiguous terms and making that process more efficient. Agentic AI would be more of something like query workflow orchestration. So monitoring incoming data, detecting discrepancies, creating draft queries, routing them to the right sites, tracking aging and escalation rules, and then following through all the way till resolution. That would be an example of an agentic AI application. And I'm not doing all of these at the moment, but they're in various states of exploration and emerging capabilities.
Great, great response, Bill. But what I understood is if it's carefully planned from the beginning, not only the digital protocol or digitizing components planning early leads to like lean protocol, and then you also kind of went into where having these technologies that can work hand in hand, and every technology has its place, whether it's generative AI or agentic AI, which plays more like a role uh, for early detection from the quality perspective. Great use case. Thank you. Now, as AI becomes more integrated into our eSource workflows, or you can call it solutions, have your have you or your team needed any specific AI related training or upskilling? We would like to learn how is that experience looks like this for, because AI is kind of technology that has been introduced, and this is a buzzword that we are hearing at every industry forum. So we wanted to understand in your experience how you were able to upskill or train your team.
Yeah, so I would say the simple answer to your question, Verna, is yes, yes, and yes. Training and upskilling is definitely part of the equation and definitely required. What I would add is that it depends heavily on what you are changing or what you're trying to achieve with your AI enabled processes. For example, using AI as an assistant, say for coding AEs or concomitant medications,
Mm-hmm.
what I mentioned earlier, it's simply a better tool than partial matching or searching dictionaries or synonym references that we might be using today. So it doesn't necessarily fundamentally change the process. The main question that comes up is where to put the human in the loop, and how does that change as you build confidence in the AI outcomes. But I think in that case, specific training for team members doing that work is a lower bar to clear. Um, so that's a
Mm-hmm.
relatively simple change compared to using AI in the eSource space as a full agentic orchestration. The example I gave earlier of query workflow, or another example would be relying on AI scribes as part of a direct data capture in a site-based eSource system. So those require much more building of confidence and training in the particular AI solution that you're using. Some of the things we've looked at is, prompt engineering comes up frequently, especially in AI solutions where you have a chatbot type interface.
Mm-hmm.
So what the outcome you get is heavily dependent on the types of prompts you get and the way you run that conversation with the AI chatbot. And that's a fundamentally different way of working than a lot of folks working in data management space or drug development in general are used to. And so we talk about prompt engineering, characteristics, and specific training around how can you be more specific and provide the appropriate context in your prompts, or use examples and templates and feed those into your AI chatbot, and then continuing to iterate and refine as
Mm-hmm.
along the lines of having a conversation with a subject matter expert colleague in your organization. Right? You don't ask one question and get one answer and you're done. It typically is a conversation over, and maybe over multiple days even. And then, other elements around efficient prompt engineering, chaining complex requests into breaking them down into specific steps and running them step by step through the
Mm-hmm.
chatbot. So there's a number of techniques that we've tried to look at and build into training courses, but it's heavily dependent on, as I said at the beginning,
Mm-hmm.
what application you're focused on. The biggest thing that I see in this space is just repetition builds confidence. So giving people places to work, places to practice, and places to start working and building their own confidence in how to interact with an AI solution and how to get answers and results that actually help them and make them more efficient in their work.
Mm-hmm. Great. So, what I understand is that having these subject matter experts have leading a conversation, building up a use case, and slowly introducing AI wherever you have a good case for to build confidence. Great.
That's exactly right. Yes.
Yep. And what AI tools are you currently using in your line function? You mentioned ChatGPT, a Copilot. Um, or any other external solutions. And if you have any opportunity to build a governance or a policy around how your organization or line function uses them.
Yeah, so we do have an internal chat portal that has access to multiple of the large language models, such as the Claude model from Anthropic and the GPT model from OpenAI. So those are our two main our main interface there into multiple different large language models. We also have Microsoft Copilot that's integrated with the Office tools, Microsoft Office tools, and that's more used for document-based work, summarizing meeting minutes into concise outcomes, helping with document authoring and document summaries, that kind of thing. The overall governance, so Novartis as an entity has put in an overall, as most companies I expect, put in an overall governance emphasizing things like the ethical use of AI, patient safety, privacy, security, regulatory compliance, things that you would expect, and I believe most companies have in place. And then that is implemented through various governance bodies and review processes through the different line functions, with a strong focus on data governance, quality, access controls, and appropriate use as a prerequisite to using AI at scale. Some of the other elements that come into play there are things like risk assessment or risk tiering, we call it. How do you assess the various risks of what you're doing with different AI models and the processes that you're using them in? And then there's other elements around human oversight. I mentioned the famous human in the loop. Where does that human in the loop appear? What exactly do they do? How is that decided and how is that designed? And then importantly, regulatory alignment. So there's the FDA discussion paper that was released and an EMA reflection paper and other elements around regulatory alignment that are very important considerations of the governance that we have in place.
Great. So, with all the risks involved, like what I hear is, every mostly every company has the governance to make sure they educate on the risks involved with the technology that it brings, and use it cautiously. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. Say, I use the analogy, Aruna, similar to what we do in risk management, just in our clinical studies. Forget about AI for a moment. With AI, it's very much a similar risk-based approach. In a rigorous way, what are the risks that I'm taking, and what are the possible impacts of those risks should they occur, and then what are the mitigations I want to apply or I can apply, and what outcomes, what assessment does that lead me to in terms of using or not using AI in particular use cases?
Yes, that's a great explanation, Bill. You mentioned risks, so I would like to go. That's a nice segue into the next question, because I'm very interested to know what are the top three challenges or risks that you have faced in implementing AI within eSource or digital protocol workflows.
Yeah, so the starting point of my thinking about risks, Aruna, is that AI is constrained by the same principle that's been described pretty much since the beginning of electronic computing, namely garbage in, garbage out. And in AI, that means poor quality training data will invariably lead to poor quality models, which invariably leads to poor results. It's almost analogous to the law of gravity. A corollary is better data, better AI. And here by better data, I mean structured data with relationships defined, control terminologies, ambiguity removed, and moving towards what is often called semantic richness in the training data. And this is one reason I'm very focused on the digital protocols as the source of a much better data describing the definition of a clinical study, and which drives the entire execution of the study. And with this as a starting point, you can go much further in applying AI, to eSource processes than you can by starting with what people typically do today with PDF protocols. So a big risk that I see is the quality of the data that's available.
Great, great. Can you share one or two examples or case studies where AI was applied in a project, eSource project, and challenges or key challenges, and ultimately what worked well in this project?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the work we're doing is exploratory, is experimental. So we're just starting to get to the point of then using a standardized digital protocol represented in the CDISC USDM digital protocol standard and
Mhm.
using that to then automate and drive associated downstream processes. So we're starting to see the first uptake of that. I don't have a lot of examples on the outcomes yet. It's really an emerging process, and it's very much based on getting the study into a first time right um, configuration, so that the data collection and the cleaning of the data is after the fact, and you're confident that you're doing the right study going forward. When you start. So this is where an example that we're seeing is the use of AI scribes or translators to capture required clinical study data at the source, where that can really make a difference in the quality of the data and picking up that eSource data. And that's an example that I call it with leading with AI. So rather than simply using AI to automate an existing process, cleaning data or following up on queries, you're
Mhm.
fundamentally changing the availability of the data, leveraging an eSource model, leveraging the digital protocols, and leveraging AI
Mhm.
capabilities.
So the
So
main risk you see is like getting the right elements together because you're working with powerful tool, it can generate what you want, but making these elements align would ease in your process of implementing AI in whatever technology you pick.
that's right. It's approaching it from a process reengineering, more holistic kind of end-to-end approach, study design,
Hmm.
configuration of my data collection tools, my eSource data collection tools, using AI, organizing the mappings, the translations, the data transformations, and then all the way through to the actual acquisition of the data, the management of the data, and the cleaning of the data for analysis, for database lock and analysis. The initial experiences, no surprise, I guess, are focused on the more common domains, adverse events, labs, vital signs, etc. And so there's a lot more um, awareness and standards that are in place and used in our organization and other organizations in those areas. So those are a natural place to get started with. And then I expect as we move on to efficacy domains and other areas that the effort will be increased and the investment needed to train the models appropriately and get productive outcomes will also go up.
Okay, great. I, so talking about AI, any technology that comes always comes with its own risks. So anything that you can share with us today with some of the main risks you have identified using AI and how those risks are mitigated?
So I think a couple of the risks that I see are, one is the rapid pace of change. So things are changing so rapidly in the capabilities of the AI models. I think Anthropic released in the past 9 months, if I got this correct, Anthropic released 7 new versions of their Claude LLM model. So that's just a pace of change that we're not used to, especially in our regulatory space. So I see that as a risk and a challenge to continue to work with that pace of change. And the expectation is that'll level out at some point and eventually slow down. But I see that as something that we're continually challenged with, is to say there's a new version of the model, it's got new capabilities. How do those impact our results? How can we take advantage of that? The other risk that I mentioned earlier was with the training data. How are models trained? What kind of data is going into the training? And and what does that mean for the outcomes that you get? And the third risk I would mention is alignment with regulatory expectations. So if you look at the FDA discussion paper and the EMA reflection paper that were issued some time ago now, they're talking about, what are the regulatory requirements and what are the capabilities that are needed to use these technologies for regulated processes and ultimately drug submissions. And the EMA paper in particular talks about things like specifications of the full model architecture, logs from the development of the model, validation and testing, training data, description of the data processing pipeline, and explicitly states that all of these things would be considered part of the clinical trial data or the dossier for drug approval. So that can be a high bar to clear when you think about the frequency of changes, as I mentioned earlier, and putting together all of this documentation to um, build confidence in the accuracy and reliability of what you're submitting to health authorities using these AI-enabled processes.
Great point, Bill. So I think that's a great message here for pharma to understand. Not only the implementing technology part and training the model, we also need to understand the validation aspect of the model to basically ensuring that we have a model that is actually providing the expected results, not probabilistic results. Right. What AI standards or frameworks are you following at your company, and what challenges have you faced in implementing or aligning with them?
So I would say, informing our governance models, there's some ISO, International Standards Organization, materials on AI governance and risk and model quality and life cycle and engineering practices. So those are, I wouldn't say we're following those by the letter, but those are informing our overall governance and the setup of our internal frameworks. And then the two papers I mentioned, which are closer to the drug development space, there's the FDA discussion paper and the EMA reflection paper, which are definitely informing thinking about how AI processes apply specifically to drug development and to for the topic here to eSource and the enablement of eSource processes. I think I see the challenges related to the technology moving so rapidly, as I mentioned, and essentially the technology is way out in front of any kind of standards and regulatory frameworks, which are by nature lagging behind. And it's natural as you need to understand and to see and experience the capabilities in order to start to write a framework or put any standards in place around it. So um, that's where we are today. My expectation is that this will start to flatten out over the next couple of years. We're currently in a highly innovative phase. And innovation, of course, is about doing things that haven't been done before, which is part of the fundamental challenge, but also the great opportunity. One of the analogies I use is that we are where we are with AI today overall. I'm not speaking specifically about the pharma industry or eSource, but just in general. It's kind of like where the internet was in, say, the mid to late 90s before you had companies like Google and Amazon, right? We're in that early stage. That's where we are with AI, and it's going to take some time before things settle out and we see the patterns and we see the most effective ways to use these technologies. And we're facing that with the governance and the standards and the frameworks as well.
Great analogy. Like, that it just makes me thinking, like, yeah, before the internet, like how people felt like the sudden explosive technology called internet coming out, where information is not physical anymore and it's all digital. Now I think we are in the same phase where everybody's talking about AI and these AI versions coming rapidly. Innovation we learn, and and we learn from this innovation, and to put the fencing frameworks
Yeah.
around.
Exactly. So think about this. Think about, I'm dating myself, but think about if you used the internet before web browsers were common, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
How different the experience is now. And then the technologies and the applications like a Google that are layered on top of that. It's almost hard to imagine what it was like before that. But I think that's where we are with AI. And in some number of years,
Hmm.
our experience of using it will be totally different than it is today.
Great. Um, Thank you. Looking ahead, what changes do you foresee in scaling AI across eSource, whether in technology, governance, or workforce readiness?
So I think the changes that we need to start tackling about around um, are moving away from automating current processes into more transformational changes in the way we work. And it's hard. I think the first generation of any technology, and AI is no different, is kind of applying it in the way you currently work to try to do things incrementally better in your current process. And that's what we see very much with the early applications with AI related to eSource. But I think I would look for moving away from that to much more transformational changes in the way we work, and it's hard to even sometimes imagine what those might be. We need the experience to create those changes, but I think there will be much more transformational changes so that in some years we may not even recognize some of the applications and tools we're working with today anymore as they've been transformed via AI technologies. That's one element. I think another element is we have to work on it, especially to scale AI across eSource and across many other processes as well, building more agile organizational and governance models to keep current with the pace of change. It's getting overwhelming with the models that we have to stay current with the pace of change, to be up to date, to see how to apply the next set of improvements, which are coming faster and faster. So building more agile organizational capabilities is another change that I foresee, and you can see it's starting to happen in some places, but I think we've got a ways to go there. And then the third I would mention is dealing with organizational disruption. So role changes, resource capacity changes, fundamental changes in the skill sets that are required and the way work gets done is definitely something that we'll be facing as we try to scale AI technologies across the eSource and the data collection processes, data acquisition processes in clinical studies. I usually think about these things in a kind of
Mhm.
change framework of awareness, understanding, commitment, and action. So, very simply, you first have to be aware of the changes. I think everybody's aware of AI, but really then deeply understanding what it's about, how it could
Mhm.
apply to different processes. And then from there, making some commitments to do things, to experiment at the beginning, explore, to push forward, and then finally taking the action to scale up and adopt these processes in a significant way.
Thank you. That's a great point that you bring, Bill. So basically, experimentation and learning from the technology is one part, but experimentation and learning from that the technology is a key factor, and then implementing and being disciplined to have the transformation change crucial at this juncture.
Sure.
I'm enthusiastic and about the impressive initiatives you are undertaking today, like digital protocol, and look forward to your innovative thinking for the future. I have personally gained valuable insights and truly appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. Thank you for the insightful discussion and sharing your AI and eSource journey with us.
Thanks so much for having me today, Aruna. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Please join us on Spotify for additional podcast episodes on AI and eSource. Thanks for listening.